Hi everyone, this is Calista. Thank you so much for tuning in to my thesis presentation of the Future Preservation Collection, a handbook to lowercase historic preservation. And this is our handbook in my hands. Yeah, there we have it. We're going to go ahead and get started. In addition to being Calista, I am also your tour guide, here to take you through this introductory handbook of lowercase historic preservation of older industrial buildings near you. Although this study is based in the city of Milwaukee, it's important to acknowledge that lowercase historic preservation is applicable across the United States, and this is only the beginning. You may be familiar with the traditional capitalized institution of historic preservation, residing within the National Park Service and responsible for the nomination and guided preservation of historic buildings in the states. Branching out from historic preservation, which by nature is conservative in its applications and selection, lowercase historic preservation is the opposite. Liberal in its selections and application, lowercase hp takes into account a multitude of normally silenced perspectives, so it is not limited to the preservationist's view of the building as an object. It acknowledges the present, as well as the past, as historical in nature. Lowercase hp investigates and sees the value in buildings and communities not typically deemed worthy of capital HP and blend into our daily lives. Let's stop letting the institutions favor a limited human experience when selecting buildings to preserve and reuse, and give more buildings and people a chance to thrive. We'll start with some background knowledge and then get into a few specific examples of lowercase historic preservation in action. This is everything that can be found in the book. We're going to have a brief overview of some of the context, spend some time on the interventions, and continue with our call to continuance. Part A, context, is where we begin. So let's take a stroll and center ourselves in the Midwestern Rust Belt city of Milwaukee. What is its relationship between historic preservation and the city look like, and how might that change? We'll see the current capital HP criteria and standards of how to choose and intervene in historic buildings, their success, faults, and how that might influence our transition to lowercase historic preservation. So we're inserting the name of any Midwest industrial city here, but specifically Milwaukee. Sitting off the coast of Lake Michigan, north of Chicago, the birthplace of many American industries, has a history distinguishable from that of other Midwestern counterparts, in most ways, but not in its relationship to capital HP. Many middle-of-the-map cities in America have a serious amount of building stock dating back to the Industrial Revolution that, in not-so-recent trends, have become the hosts for rehabilitation and reuse into, but not limited to, condos, apartments, office spaces, retail, multi-use facilities. One way Milwaukee is similar to places like Kansas City and St. Louis is the jarring tangible and intangible dividing lines that separate the city into parts by race, left over from redlining and never fully remedied. As cities progressed, so did the governmental segregation of people by racial geographic profiling, leaving industries of commerce, prospects of healthcare, and opportunities for growth by the wayside. Lack of investment and economic stimulation in these neighborhoods leads to the neglect and abandonment of buildings. Often, with generations and families staying together in these parts of town by choice or by institutional frameworks that make it seemingly impossible to otherwise, the sense of community can be found here to be insurmountable. One such neighborhood is Milwaukee's North Side. This neighborhood stretches far and wide to the north and west of Milwaukee proper, and also retains a majority of the city's African American population. Many families would have begun living in these areas near where they would have worked in factories, so these buildings are still sprinkled throughout their residential homes today. In some parts of Milwaukee, these places have been quick to be snapped up by developers and gentrified by the arrival of its new tenants. But this operation has been progressing slowly across Milwaukee's north side. What's been continuing to happen on the north side is perpetuated by many social, cultural, and institutional entities that you cannot pin it to a single cause. Old industrial buildings here get coined as properties that may yield significance in the future by institutions that guide in the reuse and assigning of worth to old and historic building stock. So what of them? They sit unused, ignored, taken for granted in places that have been pushed aside for far too long. What shall we do, you ask? And why should we care, you ask? Well, how dare you, I say. Our Midwestern cities, we really love them, but sometimes they can be slow to change and adapt. Historic preservation thrives in places with rich histories that are willing and able to comply with these rules and criteria. But many historic buildings, in Milwaukee in particular, exist in their new preserved life as a means of commodification. With a rise in urban renewal, including capital historic preservation and adaptive reuse projects, these places can serve as a beacon of heritage in the ever-evolving city. The social and economic restructuring caused by urban renewal has a distinct class dimension that can displace and marginalize underprivileged people. These are the four criteria that would determine if a building is worthy of capitalized historic preservation. They are from the National Park Service and centered around what is considered generally to be the best of the highest order and from dominant society's viewpoint. However, well that these criteria do at weeding out everything but the cream of the crop, they can be discriminatory to buildings that make up the larger patchwork of our society. Do they not deserve our attention as well? What happens when the buildings we actually live with? What happens to the buildings we actually live with when we do not value them highly? And of course, any criteria are made with the purpose of excluding something else. But when will the outliers be good enough? And when will we be good enough? So I have 4 criteria amended for determining if a building is worthy of lowercase historic preservation. And they are as follows: that the property is associated with current events that are playing a part in the ever-evolving pattern of our history, or that the property is associated with the life or lives of people who live with it, or that people who live with it identify and associate themselves with it, or C, the property embodies distinctive characteristics that suggest the passage of time and usage in its type, construction, and materials, or in their wear, or that the property has the ability to yield information of the present or the future. So these are the 4 criteria that would determine if a building is worthy of lowercase historic preservation, and they differ from those of capital historic preservation in that the qualities that make them worthy are associated with the present time, people, and non-monetary intangible qualities. It's about the preservation of what is most important to people today, and as years pass, what is most important to those people. The lowercase historic preservation should read as a chronicle of our movement in time, physically and psychologically. Worth and treatments will change in the context of time, contrary to a standard set of preservation guidelines that is about the physical and the best ways to keep that intact historically. To define preservation in its lowercase is about the decapitalization, quite literally. Using lowercase historic preservation criteria allows for the consideration of old buildings that affect our daily lives and advocates for their own well-being that is tied to ours. Historic is of the past, but also of the present, and it is important to be able to perceive the present as historical in order to imagine the future. Given that, the qualities of a building that define historic are more easily applied to the contemporary and evolving times, giving people the opportunity to choose what is important to them. There are 8 standards from Capitol Historic Preservation that are how you would kindly treat a building that would be deemed worthy by the criteria, how you would treat them. And as a whole, they're trying their best, but they could have more respect for the present. Instead of a building reused as it would have historically, or for a new purpose that exclusively maximizes its features, spaces, and spatial relationships, it would be more relevant to not only think of the building as an object meant for the best utilitarian use, but to take into account what may be best for the life of the building and its surrounding people. Might that be just as important? Instead of the historic character of a building being precisely preserved, what would it mean to do with that respect to what is of historic of the building today? Perhaps some elements relevant then and now would surface, but it would give a chance for others not historically seen. These standards mean well, but to become a version that transitions from their use for the commodification of historic buildings to a version that becomes useful for our present and future. We move to here. Here we have lowercase historic preservation intervention, category, and strategy. So let's say to get to a place where changes to a larger system would take place, one may have to start small at the scale of an intervention. So the following guidelines for intervening in lowercase historic preservation buildings are motivated by a calling to attention of the interior and exterior, while promoting new interaction that eventually results in a new use of the building, serving and relevant to the immediate surrounding. Lowercase HP interventions are tasked with exposing elements of these buildings commonly overlooked by a capital HP and are promoting further inspection and use. They manifest in 3 theoretical and physical forms that promote interaction in the building's unused state and would also support new use of the building. These interventions are a cut, a curtain, and a cast. A cut to a lowercase HP building serves as a portal into the secret interior life of the building and exposes the malleable nature of these old forgotten sites. It would cause people to see the tangible and intangible fractures around them at a larger scale. This also contradicts in principle to capital HP by taking away building fabric, but this, in addition to the prior, calls attention to the site and message for mending, with the goal of not only mending the cut, but the site as a whole. The cut will have begun to heal the building and community it graced. A few guidelines for the cut are that it will either be expanded upon from an existing significant architectural element and be connected to or respond adjacently, will be no less than 3.5 feet wide and adjust to architectural elements to allow for future use as a portal to enter or another purpose, will have a depth and height enough for a person to inhabit it or more, will maintain the structural integrity of the building, and will only take away existing building fabric, only adding if necessary for the structural integrity, in kind with the existing. Lowercase HP intervention guidelines for a curtain aim to cover historic fabric, revealing other traits of the building and site not noticed when viewed in full. Taking place on a large scale, the unusual curtain draws attention to the overlooked buildings and guides movement of people around the site. The obstruction of the building's defining physical features is not something one would find in capital historic preservation, but is crucial in lowercase historic preservation's notion of historic not meaning the past, but also the present, with the goal of bringing to the forefront that which the curtain hides. A few of these guidelines for a curtain would be that it will occupy no less than 2 facades of the building and could but does not have to be continuous, It will not always be at a height that a pedestrian could reach, but always partially visible. It will guide pedestrians' eyes and feet to notable features around the building and to paths around it. It will be printed upon with the walls of the interior and has the ability to move and degrade over time. It will not interfere with the structural integrity of the building. And our last intervention guideline is a cast. So a cast on a lowercase historic preservation building conveys the impression of the interior spaces on the outside, announcing itself, displaying unevenness, cracks, and saying that that's okay. It reflects the community surrounding the building, reaching out with a gesture of acceptance and use. A cast in a capital HP typically serves as a form of documentation or a tool for replication, contributing to something other than itself. The lowercase historic preservation cast reaches its goal when it exposes the interior, not only as the interior, but as a reflection of time and human use. And a few of these guidelines would be that it would either be directly expanded upon from an existing significant architectural element and be connected to or respond adjacently. It will only add to the existing building fabric and kind. It will provide a function to the pedestrians such as cover or seating. It will maintain structural integrity of the building, and it will be made of a material that has the ability to be imprinted with the walls of the interior, such as, but not limited to, concrete, plaster, rubber. And now we have arrived at part B of interventions for lowercase HP. At this point, you might be wondering how the lowercase historic preservation criteria and guidelines for intervening may come into fruition in some of our older great Milwaukee building stock, specifically, like mentioned before, in the north side. Ahead, we're going to see 3 lowercase historic preservation buildings, how they qualify, and what it means what it looks like to intervene in them with the 3 operations. Location 1 is located at 3210 North Pierce in North Milwaukee and is worthy of lowercase historic preservation under criteria C, that it embodies distinctive characteristics that suggest the passage of time and usage in its type, construction, and materials, and in their wear. This building and all of the other buildings featured in this book were listed in a survey of Milwaukee's industrial building stock with the aim of identifying potential capital historic preservation sites for preservation. But from it came a category of buildings that were classified as properties that may yield significance later. Our friend here fell in that latter. At each location, I am going to call out one of the intervention strategies, and here we have the cast. So the cast in this location is located on the north and northwest side of the existing building, taking form and expanding from the sills of 2 old existing wooden framed windows on the side of a garage extremity. Why here instead of any other place on the building? This narrow, non-major side of the building is the first one people encounter when crossing the street to follow the beer line trail behind the building. With an inviting seat here, the pedestrian has the chance to investigate the cast, interacting with it directly, taking a closer look at the building as they continue their walk. The cut here takes place on one of the non-major facades of the building, inhabiting an existing extremity of the building, currently hosting the cut. The people may enter and be granted with a glimpse of the inside from this tall portion. The curtain in this building occurs at intervals coinciding with the outwardly expressed structural piers and occurs on the south and west facades as the 2 streets join pedestrians from the neighborhood as well as the beer line. Next up on our lowercase HP buildings is 1408 North 5th Street and is a lowercase historic preservation building most strongly identifying under criteria B, a property that is associated with the life or lives of people who live with it, or that the people who live with it identify and associate themselves with it. So this building was home to a non-major beverage company and housed its bottling operations. And it was bought just 1 year ago for a huge amount more than the value of the estimate. And so someone else has seen the potential in this location and has been picked as a property that may yield significance in the future, but it already seems significance by its existence. Emphasized here in this location is the cut. The cut is located on the west facade of the building and makes its home in the place of one of the existing single-pane windows. This narrow cut is using an existing opening to avoid damaging masonry structure, but does make a move of extending down through the base. So why here as opposed to anywhere else on the building? It takes place in the midst of the row of single-pane windows, interrupting the rhythm but also maintaining it, pulling pedestrians towards the center of the facade where they can experience the most from the interior of the cut. The cast in this location follows vertical structural bays expressed on the exterior, breaking up the windows on the main south facade, and extends down to provide seating for pedestrians. The curtain in this location occupies two facades of the west and the south, and taking place here on these two key walkways connects neighborhoods to the north and industrial buildings along the other axis. The third and final location we'll be looking at is 1748 North 13th Street, that most strongly identifies with the lowercase preservation criteria that it is associated with current events that are playing a part in the evolving pattern of our history. This building was bought for nearly $20,000 less than the value estimate, and it's clear that the property in this area resides and is undervalued due to its residence and history that is perpetuated by the fact that investment into the community is withheld by the same institution that is underlyingly causing the devaluation. Identified as a property that may yield significance in the future, it already has significance and value that it needs to open up and be useful for its community. The curtain in this location is located on the upper half of the south and west facades of the building. Secured from the roof and draping down, it flows independently of the facade. And then why here instead of anywhere else on this building? The narrow west facade, being the most articulated of the structure, is strongly butted up to the completely blank south facade, masking the building's key architectural features and detailing on the top banding, in addition to masking the blank facade, levels the playing field of importance between these two sides and prompts the question of value. The cut in this location is located on the east facade at the back of the building, utilizing one of the arched windows from the second floor and expanding down to encompass a previous back door entry. The cast in this location is located on both the main south and the minor east facade, extending from banding between two sets of windows and providing a shelter, interest, and stopping point. We've reached our call for continuance. Just finished looking at a very small sampling of lowercase historic preservation buildings and interventions. Now that attention has been called, we must continue the work. What can you do to push for lowercase historic preservation in the fight for taking care of our unused and undervalued old building stock while advocating for the respectful and relevant raising up of our neighborhoods and cities equally? So here, as a call to action, lowercase historic preservation is about the past and the future through our present. Using lowercase historic preservation allows for the consideration of old buildings that affect our lives daily and advocates for their well-being that is tied to our own. Historic is of the past, but also of the present. It is important to be able to perceive the present as historical in order to imagine a future. Milwaukee, other Midwestern cities across the United States, have had a struggle between commodity-driven historic preservation, developer-driven reuse of buildings that have been deemed valuable enough to do so, and then this other outer ring of buildings that don't quite fall into either category and get left behind. Some may be in plain sight and others hidden, but that's their beauty, of being ingrained into our daily lives. We can begin to identify these locations from completed building stock surveys like Milwaukee's Industrial Building Survey, where these buildings featured in the handbook were listed as may yield significance in the future, to investigating buildings you find in your own neighborhoods. You may use the criteria of lowercase historic preservation to put name to the value of your found building. Through collaboration, you can carry out standards and guidelines of intervening in lowercase HP buildings to start envisioning and executing a cut, a curtain, or a cast. To do this is to spark change and challenge the status quo of what most people would see the building as at surface level. The inside-out exposure of interiors, perhaps never before seen by the people who live with these buildings daily, prompts further inspection and introspection. This calls for a new use of the building as the intricacies of the location surface, and people see it as more than the abandoned building on the corner. To have agency over preservation of the places we live in and the time we live in is how we elevate our communities and continue to grow as a whole. So take this with you and start thinking of how lowercase historic preservation can make an impact wherever you are. We have an appendix of resources, and that is our handbook. Thank you very much for listening.